Okay, so I've got 13 people now. There might be a few more coming in a couple of minutes, maybe. So as I was saying before, what I want to cover tonight mostly is how we can use Google Maps. It's actually very easy, much easier than it has been, I suppose, in previous years. So, you know, by the end of today's session, you should be able to all set up a Google Maps application. We've still got more people arriving. Okay, so we've got the session recording as well. So I think we'll get started. So we'll look at how we can set up a Google Maps application. It just works like Google Maps works on your own device. And you can see that we've got a marker here over Sydney. Can everybody hear me? And can everybody see my shared screen? I think you should be able to.
Yes.
Yep, okay, that's good. Sometimes when you're on Zoom and nobody says anything, so it's hard to know what's going on. Okay, so that's Google Maps. We'll look today at how you can do the basics of that. So we'll move the emulator over here. We've got our code here. We don't actually really need that right now. Okay, we'll get rid of this as well. Okay, so we do have a presentation for this. And I would encourage you, you know, if you've got multiple screens on your desktop, or if, you know, have a look at the presentation notes as I do the video lecture. That will cover everything I've covered today, and a few other things as well. So, you know, do have a look at that. Okay, we've got more people coming. Okay, we've got 15 people now. I think that's just about everyone. Okay, so if you want to create a Google Maps application, it will literally only take about 5 minutes. Okay, so you need to have Android Studio running. And what you need to do is to go to New Project. And it makes it really easy. You just need to click on New Google Maps Activity and select Next. Okay. And we'll call this Gmaps 2. And we'll create that application. Okay, we've got more people coming. Okay, so for you guys that have just arrived, we're just looking at creating a Google Maps application today. I'll just do that last little bit again, so you can see what's happening. So to set up it, you guys might like to do this as I talk about it. So to set up a Google Maps application, all you need to do is to go to File, New, and then New Project. Scroll down a little bit, and then to create a little Google Maps activity, click Next, fill in some of the details. I'll just call this example 2. You want to change the language to Java, and then hit Finish. And so what Android Studio will do, it'll create a little Google Maps sample application for you to run. And it will work, but it doesn't work out of the box. So there's a few things that you have to do. And I'll show you, I suppose it's easy to miss, right? So Google Maps, and I suppose any of the other external services that you can connect to with Android, is normally pretty simple if you go down the right path and you select all of the correct options. But as soon as you go off that path, right, then it becomes a little bit tricky. So I'll try and show you what happens if it's not working correctly as well. So a couple of important things of this. So if we want to access Google Maps, you need to have some extra permissions. There's a little comment here saying that this is not really required, but normally if you have a map application, you probably want to access where your user currently is. So in this little sample project that they create for you, they've added this extra little permission. So what this does is it just allows the map application to access their devices, their cell phone, their tablets, internal GPS location services, and it's then able to access the user's latitude and longitude, so it can locate where they are on the map. So we have to add extra permissions. This is a setup permission that goes inside of our Android manifest file. So in Android, there's two types of permission. There's these permissions that get baked into our application, and they're all defined inside of our Android manifest file. So I suppose that's the old way of defining permissions in Android. And now with newer versions of Android, we also, so all of these permissions, they're all set up, and the user grants access to these permissions inside of the manifest file, right, at install time. So I like to call them install time permissions. And so the user is just prompted to, when the application's installed from the Play Store, they're just prompted to allow these different permissions at that point. And then, you know, in addition, with newer versions of Android, they've slightly changed the security model so that you have these installed time permissions that you define in the manifest file, but you've also got some extra runtime permissions as well. We don't actually have any runtime permissions in this example, but that's something that we'll get into in later weeks. So Android Studio, it has created everything for us. So it set up the permission, other things that have been set up for us. So it's also created a little sample maps activity fragment, and it's called a fragment because that's the layout technology that it uses. More on fragments later in the semester. And so you still have your standard onCreate method, right? But it's a little bit different because it has to now support the maps fragment, which gets loaded in the onCreate method. But you know, you don't have to do anything here. It's just done for you by that little wizard. So it's really, really nice. So this sets up your layout with the fragment for your map. And then the important method is, or I suppose the important interface is the onMapReady callback, which has been implemented for us, and that creates this little method here, which enables us to get access to a reference of our Google Map, and then to do things like add markers to our Google Map, move the camera around, and do all sorts of stuff. So, you know, when you're exploring this, there's all sorts of different things that you can do. The main thing that most people seem to do is to add these so-called markers. right? And a marker is one of these little red buttons that come up on the user's application. So just go back into the maps activity. So this is a marker. And if we click on the marker, it'll give us some information. It'll give us a little annotation as well. So that little marker annotation, that corresponds to the little title field that we've got here. And the longitude and the latitude and the longitude rather for Sydney, that's these coordinates here. And I believe this is because Google Maps was originally developed by a team in Sydney. So, you know, there are other methods available, and you can explore those in your own time, really. I'll just give you a quick rundown of those. They're all relatively simple. I'll just make sure this is coming, but I'll still present them over here. I just need to make sure my presentation's coming out on the right monitor. Okay, here we go. So I've already talked about all of this. So this has just got some extra instructions on how to set up your Google Maps activity. I'll go through all of this stuff a little later. But, you know, you can do all of these other things as well. You can do things like a circle shape. And then, you know, you've got the syntax for that down here. It's very, very simple, really. So whenever you want to interact with your Google Map, you just interact with that maps object and then call all of those different methods like add circle, all those types of things. So the only thing I'm saying that these methods are simple, they are, but the part that is not simple is actually getting your application registered. That's the hard part. So it's not so much the programming with Google Maps that's tricky. The tricky parts are getting your application registered, which we'll come to. And the other tricky part is making sure that your application has the correct permissions, which is something else that we'll come to as well. So, you know, you can define circle shapes. You can set up a polyline shape as well. And so that just allows you to define a little polygon. Oh, and we've got one more person to come in. So you can define polygonal shapes for your map application. I believe that's a wireframe. And you can also define a polygon shape. Oh, okay, so you can see that this is a closed polygon. The polyline could be open. You can define ground overlays. So you can do things like use an icon or something and put that on top of your Google Map if you want to customize the behavior of Google Maps even more. So you can do things like that. So you can take a picture of something and then a nice icon, a nice marker, and then use that as a marker in your application. One thing to note here is that it's the width and the height of your icon. That's in meters, so you can get it to cover a huge amount of area with an icon. So it's not like a marker as such. It will scale with the map. Okay, so these are things that you guys can explore in your own time. The main thing that you need to know how to use is the marker. And how to add markers. The other thing that sometimes throws people is that you add a marker, right? But then you want to remove it. well, removing is actually pretty easy. You just have to call the clear method. And that will allow you to remove all of the markers from the screen. So if we do this and I call clear at the end, we've got a marker in Sydney. If I rerun this, this will remove that marker, which is, not that useful, but it kind of shows you that, if you need to remove the markers, this is the type of thing that you can do. Oh, and somebody's asking, what about a specific marker? Okay. You can't remove a specific marker. It's a very simple API. You might be able to in some other way, but I haven't. Looking at it, the only way I've found to remove markers is to call this clear method, and it removes everything. So it's a little bit. It's quite heavy duty, but I suppose most of the time we won't have that many markers. I did have a look for things like a remove method, but we don't have that. The other thing that I did try, if you can step into your marker method here, and you can see that it actually returns a marker method. So I was also thinking, maybe if we use the marker object itself, then we might be able to use that to remove itself. But maybe there's some way of doing that with is visible. Perhaps set visible. We can try set visible. Maybe set visible would do that. It's interesting. There's also a Z index. So there's all sorts of things that you can do. Right, and somebody's saying it says remove there, and I'm not sure which method they were.
Maybe just try writing R and it will show up.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, okay, yes. So there is a, yeah, okay, good. That was really well spotted. Okay, yeah, okay, so there is a marker.remove method as well if you wanted to remove a specific one. Yeah, so you can also give that a try. Yeah, okay, good, well spotted, Lakshay. Okay, so these are some of the things that you can do with Google Maps. That's the setup of your activity. And I did rerun it without the marker. And I think I must have been running my other application previously, because I've actually just come up against, I suppose, the first failure mode for Google Maps. So when Google Maps isn't working, this is actually what you get. So you get a little Google icon, and it kind of looks like it's Google Maps, but it's taken over the entire screen, but you've got nothing. So this is, I suppose, a way of telling that that your Google application isn't working, right? And in our case, right, that's because we haven't registered it. Okay. So I've got our logcat. I think our logcat should tell us what's going on here, but we'll have a look. Okay. So I've got it on verbose logging. I'll just try the error log. It might give us a bit more information. Okay, so you can see here that this is the problem. Okay, so you can see that if we look at the, I mean, the thing with Logcat is that there can and there are hundreds of error messages. So sometimes you have to either change the logging category. I was on verbose before, and there's hundreds and hundreds of messages. A lot of them are not actually even relevant to us. It's just internal things that are happening inside of Android. So, but we can switch that over to the error log, and there's still hundreds of other messages that are happening, but we can scroll up a little bit and we can see here that it's saying that we've got an authorization failure. And that's because we haven't set up our Google Maps application. So, Android Studio, it's done almost everything for us, right? But this is the failure mode that I think most students come up against. And for whatever reason, they have trouble getting past it sometimes. But hopefully my explanations today will kind of smooth things over for you. I think what normally happens is that I explain this in a lecture, and then you have to do the assignment or the lab sessions a couple of weeks later, and you've remembered most of the things about Google Maps, but you forgot like a little bit of the detail maybe. So we can see we've got an authorization failure. So we've got the manifest, I've explained that. We've got the maps activity, I've explained that. So we'll come back to the removal of the clearing and the removal of markers once we've got our Google Maps application actually set up. We've got a layout over here. So this has all been predefined for us, so we don't really have to do too much here. So we've got a maps fragment that's been defined for us over here. And you can see that that's using this little bit of syntax here, and we're using the support fragment. And that corresponds back to how we're adding the fragment in the maps activity over here. So this is where we set up our map fragment, and we have to do that in code. But we have a placeholder for that over here inside of our fragment layout. So I'm kind of glossing over the details of fragments right now because it's been given to us. Android Studio has auto-generated it for us, which is really nice. So you've got the manifest file, you've got the maps activity. We've slightly customized that with our code down here. We've got a layout file, which we don't have to do anything with. And so all of the, I guess all of the important part is here. We have to register our application. And actually it makes it's easy to overlook, I suppose, but it's actually fairly easy to set up. So you just have to read this comment. And I think the tricky thing here is that the registration, the authorization, right, is specific to your application. It's specific to your project, it's specific to your computer. So if you're trying to share projects with your friends, or you're trying to download a project, say from Moodle, which is a normal thing to do, when you come to use that Google Maps project, it's not going to work because the authorization will have changed, and the fingerprint for your project and your version of Android Studio, that will also have changed as well. So you can see here that we've got a fingerprint for this particular project on my computer. So it's a little bit tricky. So if you set this up on a different computer, then you'll have a slightly different SHA-1 fingerprint. And the thing is that your Google Maps application, it's only it's only authorized for that specific fingerprint. So if the fingerprint changes, which is what happens if you copy a project and open it on a different computer, then you would need to re-register your application, and you'd need to then work out how can you regenerate this SHA-1 fingerprint. And so that's something that's actually quite tricky. So I would just recommend that you use the, I mean, it is possible to get your SHA-1 fingerprint, right? But for a new Android programmer, it's probably not something that you want to do. So it's all tied, to your package name and your version of Android Studio as well. But it's actually, so there, I guess the warnings, just to say, yeah, this is hard, but it's actually quite easy as well. Because they've given us this little, it's quite easy, I should say, if you use the wizard, right? So if you've created a new project, right, it'll auto-generate this for your package structure, your package name for your version of Android Studio. And there's no public fingerprint either, no, sadly, because the fingerprint is not something that you can control. It's a fingerprint of your, I suppose, your workspace, of your project. And it will change if you move your project around. But if you use the wizard, right, all you have to do is copy this URL. And I don't know if we can control, yeah, we can control click this, that's good. And so, you can control click onto that. And yes, this would only be for development mode as well. And you can also create you can get the fingerprint for your production APK file, right? And then you can link that with your Google Maps account. And then, your company or you yourself, you will be charged for how you use Google Maps. So there's some thousands or so requests that you can make to Google Maps freely, that you get those requests, I think, every day to just have a play around with and, develop your application. So for us as, beginner Android programmers, that's okay. But if you have an application that heavily uses Android's, Google's Google Maps API, then you have to sign up for an account. And then every time your users use Google Maps, you're going to be charged some fraction of a cent for their usage of that application. Okay. So when you click that URL, you come to this little page here, and it's actually really nice in the documentation here. It also just tells you what you need to do. It just says to get one, follow this link, follow the directions, and press create at the end. So we can do that. Create a project. That's what we want to do, and we can go to continue. So if you register, you can see up here, it's talking about $300 credit, right? So if you create a real application, you have to actually sign up with your credit card details, your company's credit card details, set up an account for your application's usage. Okay, so we'll just create an API key. And this API key stuff, this used to take a long time to come through, but these days it seems to be pretty much instantaneous. Okay, I'm just going to make the screen bigger. So you can see here that we've got a new API key, and that API key, that only links to my version of the application. So, you know, you could copy this, but it would no longer be valid. So if you just click this little link here, it'll copy it for you. If you had a copy of my key, it wouldn't really be valid for your package structure. So we just copy the API key, and we just put it in here. And if we rerun, and I'm just going to stop the emulator, but if we rebuild our application, I'm pretty sure if we just rerun it, it will work, but we'll just rebuild just to be sure. Okay, and then we'll rerun. Okay, and there you go. You can see that we now have a Google Maps application, and you can see that we are centered on Sydney. Somebody was asking before where Perth is. Perth is just over here. And, you know, Auckland, so we now have a Google Maps application that we can interact with inside of our Android application. So, you know, you can do all sorts of things. You can overlay controls on top of your Google Maps application. You can have like a split screen for some navigation tools, or you could have a navigation drawer or a menu system that you could couple with your Google Maps application. Okay, and I just clicked and dragged something, so I'm just going to undo that. Okay, so you can see here that maps.clear, that is clearing my marker. And so let's just try marker.remove. That also looks like it should work. Sometimes, of course, these things don't quite work as advertised, but we'll give it a try. Okay, so we can also see that the marker has been removed, so that also works. So you can also use marker.remove. And if we remove all of that code and put the marker back in, we should get our marker back. So I really think with Google Maps, the development side of things is not hard. It's just, you know, when you come to do your assignments or your actual project, people like to try and take a shortcut or, you know, share code with friends, and it's not really possible. You can see here that our marker is back. And so, you know, you can add markers any way you like. So if you can get the longitude and the latitude for Auckland City, you can also add that in for Auckland as well. Now, last night, I did have a go at coupling this with the location services tools. It's interesting. It was working last night, but it's not working now. But I'll just give it another go. We'll just try running this again. It might be that I've somehow messed up my permissions. So we'll try and get this running as well. Are there any questions about Google Maps so far?
Yeah, like like in Google Maps, when when in the real Google Maps application, we have buttons, right? Like buttons which are on the map, and a search bar which is on the map. How can we get like those things showing up over the map?
Yeah, okay. Like, that's an interesting question. I'm not actually 100% sure because I haven't tried that. Maybe it's something that you can. Oh, this is not the project I wanted to look at. Maybe it's something. This is what I wanted to look at. Yeah, you might need to build all of that. Yes, that's what I'm thinking. But I was also wondering if it's something that you can enable. I'll just bring back my other projects. I was thinking maybe it's some options that you can enable using your map object. You can have a quick look. So we've got sets, content description, location source, map style. There might be some, there are things like zoom preferences. You've got click listeners, which might be useful. It doesn't look like that just works out of the box. It looks like it would have to be something that you build on top of your application. You've just got the map and that's it. So things like that, I know that there's actually a separate API, right, for doing things like address search. So that's a different API, and it in Google's web view, or I suppose Android Maps application, they've kind of tied it all together. But I know when you're searching for an address, for example, that's a different API. And so, you can type in an address, and what it will do is it will search the database of names and, well, of names, addresses, streets, locations, all of that. It'll search those, and then it'll give you a latitude and longitude to tell the map application where the marker should go. So I agree. I think it's probably something you have to build. I can have a look and see if there's any options. Nothing. Just looking at the different setup options here, nothing looks like it would enable those. But you never know. There might be some easy way of turning that on. Okay, and so we're trying our other application. Right. Right. So this appears to be working. So I'm just going to try. So this is my location services application. And normally I try and separate this, the maps activity, well, the maps presentation and the location services presentation. I just thought both topics kind of go together, so I'll try and present them at the same time. So I can get this working on its own. I'll see if I can get the example I put together with location services and Google Maps integrated together working. I'll just bring this one over. I'll just stop this one. Okay, we'll try running this one. Okay, it's interesting. It doesn't seem to be quite working. Last night when I did this, it just worked straight away, really, really quickly, but it's not doing anything now. It might be that I've got a problem with my permissions. Because I was also playing around with the permissions. So you can see here that I'm also, you can play around with application permissions inside of the emulator. I think what I want is not this one. But this one. Okay, recent location requests. Oh, that's interesting. So it is doing location requests. It's just not doing anything with them. Okay. So, sorry guys, just bear with me for a minute. I'll just see what's going on with my code. I'm just going to toggle a breakpoint here. This was working last night. It's just that it's not working right now.
When you run the code, it shows the buttons at the bottom, like a navigate button and a map button. Maybe try touching those, pressing those, and see. Maybe it gives maybe it activates the location, the marker.
Oh, yeah, we can try that. I'll just try this. I'll just try debugging my code and see if it's actually updating the markers. Maybe that's the problem. Right, and you were saying that there's some kind of button here. I'm not sure what you mean.
Maybe it was the other application you opened. Like I saw a button at the bottom of the screen just a few minutes ago when the application.
Oh, yeah, and that said get location. So I've got that one working. Maybe I should just talk about that. I'll give this one last shot. Just bear with me. So I'll just try debugging it again. Okay. So what do we want? We want step over. Step into, we don't want that. We just want step over. Right, now I think for whatever reason, this is false. I was playing around with the permissions stuff and maybe it's just this one line of code that's breaking things. So I might just try this without this. I was trying to make my application really nice with the permissions, but it's not. That's the second part of map applications that is hard, is using the permissions. Right, so this is looking better. I think I was just I kind of just clobbered my code last night. It happens sometimes, right? So this is just a very limited example of how you can combine a map application, right, with location services. So there's a second, and as I said it before, the hard part of this is not really the development; it's just the permissions model. And I think it's probably worthwhile dedicating a class to just discussing that. And we'll come to that next week. But you know, it's really not too bad to, you can zoom in a bit here. It's not too bad to actually combine a maps application with a location services application. So, you know, we can do things like track the user's location and then put a marker on that. So over here with our maps application, I've tried to center somewhere on Unitech. I was going for the vicinity of building 183. Not quite sure if I got there, but you can kind of see that we do have Unitech. And this is all coming through the location services package. So, you know, we've set up, so far what we've done is we've set up a Google Maps application. The main thing that you don't have to do very much there, the main thing you have to do there is to set up that API key. And then, you know, to make your application more interesting, it's only a little bit more of a step to add location services to it. And if you're doing that with an emulator, like probably most people, you can come up here, and with the very latest version of the emulator, it's got a really nice, if you go into the location tab, it's got a really nice little search box for doing for adding different routes and things. So if we look for a single point, it's weird, I can't click into this thing now. It was working. Let me just try it on, oh, okay, it's working now. It's just a little bit, I think I had a modal window or something open. But anyway, if you click into location, right, in the emulator, well, let me start again. So I'm more clear about what I'm talking about. So you have your application running, right? And you want to get into the application properties. So there's some things with an emulator that you can't really do. So one of those things is location services, but you can kind of fake it, right? And so the way that you do that is to get into the settings. So you click the little ellipsis icon, and inside of that, you know, you've got all sorts of different options. You can have virtual sensors, battery life, phone information. The one we're interested in, you know, there's all sorts of different things that you can get into. I guess for plugging different mock interfaces into your application as you test it. So what we've got here is a mock location service, and it's actually really nice to use when it works. So you can type in things like Mount Roskill or anything that you're interested in. And then you can get the longitude and the latitude for that. So if we wanted to, you know, change our location to that location, we can do that. So, you know, you just click save point here. You can give it a little description, and it becomes a point over here. And then we can select that and then set that as our location. And then when we go back to our application over here, you can see that it's actually moving that point. So it kind of interpolates where the user is currently. This is all just stuff that's built into Google Map. And you can see that we're moving to Mount Roskill from Mount Albert. And if you're using your own phone, it will definitely take it'll take the location of your phone. Some phones do have like a test menu built into them. So you could probably mock up the location with that as well. But I think that's like a developer mode option. You probably have to tap the About button or something 5 times to unlock the developer mode. So, we can set the location and we can have a nice visualization of that with our Google Map application. Okay, so we've talked about what you can do. Now, I suppose the tricky part is how do you actually do that? So again, we've got some lecture notes for this, and I'll just bring those up quickly. Well, we'll have a look at the lecture notes in a minute, but I think it's more important to just show you what you need to do and how we do this. So you can see here that we've still got our on map ready method, right? And we've still got our on create method, but this time, right, what we're doing is we are now creating a so-called fused location provider client. So this is an extra library again, but it's a free library that you can add to your project. And what it does is it plugs into the GPS location services, also the network location services, and it'll give you a very, very good estimate of where the user actually is. So if you look into the nitty-gritty details of how GPS and how location services work on Android, you can get down into the raw GPS interface, so you can get the coordinates directly out of the GPS sensor in your device. You can also get the raw locations out of the so-called network provider location service as well. And these are all good, but they're also hard to use and error prone. So what Google have done is they've created an API that sits on top of that called the Fuse Location Provider, which it will either use the GPS sensor or it will use the network provider sensor as well. The network provider isn't really a sensor as such, but it's more of an interpolation based on things like where the cell tower is, where the Wi-Fi access point is. So it's more of an estimation. So, and these things, they also have a cost with battery life as well. So if you are continuously polling the GPS sensor, then that's going to consume a lot of battery life. But if you use the network provider sensor, it's more of a virtual sensor, then that doesn't use as much power because it's not using a sensor inside of your mobile phone. It's just using a network created interpolation. So what
a
yep.
question here. So do you know where the data for the Wi-Fi access point location is stored? Like, is it a for the interpolation, like
Where is it
different?
stored?
Yeah. Like who has this information about the access points location?
Exactly. It's yeah. So it's not that kind of level of detail is not available to most access points. I think what I think happens is, when you set up your little router or something in your bedroom, you don't say this is at this GPS coordinate, right? So I think it's a very high level estimate from where the router is on the internet. And so based on where the router is on the internet and its level of connectivity and things, there's some kind of synthetic network coordinates that are created to, you know, get an estimate of where that router is in real world space. But, you know, that's not a great estimate.
Sure. It,
Uh,
it could be that maybe Google stores it with our, like say we connect, it takes our location with the, like the GPS location, and then also sees, okay, usually when the GPS location is here, the Wi-Fi name is this one, or the MAC address of the access point is this one. So anonymous data is sent to Google, like, oh, this location is associated with this MAC address of the uh, API, like access point, and then it may use that to give the other kind of network location kind of thing.
yeah, well, yes, I'm not, to me, I guess for our purposes, we don't have to really worry about how exactly they're getting that information. We just have to appreciate that if we use the network sensor, the network location sensor, then, you know, it is an estimate. You know, the cell towers, they know where they are. So it uses like the network location sensor. It uses like the cell tower. It uses your where you are in the internet, your Wi-Fi address, all those kind of things in combination to come up with an estimate of where you are. Maybe you've seen that perhaps if you're in a shopping center where you can't get GPS service because it's an enclosed indoor area. And you know, you can kind of still navigate with Google Maps, or if you're in an airport or something, you can kind of still navigate based on, I suppose, waypoints and things. That, you know, if you notice where you are on the map in Google Maps, it's not exactly really where you are. It's just an estimate. How Google actually does that, I guess we can only really guess at the details. But you know, you could research and work out how they do it. But you know, for today, you just need to appreciate that if you use the network stuff, it's a very rough estimate of where you are really.
Okay, cool.
So and both of these APIs, the network provider API and the GPS provider API, they're very low level, right? And so the Fuse location provider client, this guy here, I'm going to see if I can annotate my, yeah, it looks like I can annotate. Yeah. Let's see if I can annotate. Yeah, that's good. Sorry about, I was a little bit off at the end there. But this guy here, the location services get Fuse location provider client, what it does is it tries to maximize battery life by fusing the information with filtering, and it combines the network provider coordinate with the GPS provider coordinates alternatively. So, you know, sometimes it uses the network estimate, the network provider's estimate. Sometimes it uses the real GPS provider's real GPS coordinate. And so, you know, it gives you your location using this, I guess, aggregated information that's been averaged and interpolated nicely. We're not privy to how it works behind the scenes, but I imagine that it, you know, it uses some pretty heavy duty algorithms behind the scenes to do that interpolation from, you know, your network coordinates to your GPS coordinates, combining it, filtering it, all of that, so that it's not jittery and all of that. But what it does is it gives us a really nice API to get the user's location without having to get our hands dirty with trying to access the GPS or the network provider sensor for that matter. And, you know, then try and combine those results. It does it all for us. So we just have to use this. Well, there's nothing stopping you using the other one, but this probably makes life a lot easier. So just clear all the drawings. Okay, let's close the annotations. So that's what we do, is we just create this little client, and that combines those that coordinate information for us. And then we can use the client later on in our map after we've checked all the permissions. All right, so this is just this code here. This is the tricky part of this, I suppose. This is just some boilerplate code to check that our application has this access find location permission enabled. So I've kind of hacked this in my example tonight, because there's a little bit of code. While it being while it's boilerplate code, it's also not quite working. But I've kind of hacked it by going into my settings directly. So on your emulator, you know, you can change the settings as well. So you can go into settings and change the permissions. So that's how I got this working. If you run this example, you'll see that it has some problems. But if I just go into this, okay. But it's actually really only working because I've enabled the location, use location for Google Maps 2020 manually inside the settings. Just get out of the application info. So my little bit of code here, it's got some problems, but I'll fix that up for next week and take you through it. So right now I'm kind of glossing over the permission stuff just because that actually happens to be the complicated part. Okay, so kind of digressed a little bit there, but so with this bit of code, we've created our client object, right? And then down here after checking the permissions, right, we can then use our client to actually get our so-called last location. So, you know, it's doing this interpolation and getting the so-called last location. So it's not kind of, I suppose, spamming the GPS sensor over and over again. And the way that you interact with this is a little bit interesting. So you don't just get a location back. You get this task that has been templated to provide a location back. So, so one thing I think people get wrong here is they try calling last location, right? They then try unbundling the result directly like this. And normally, I suppose with a normal application request, that kind of thing would normally be okay. But with this particular application API, that's not how you use it. But if we try that, we can have a look at what happens if you do that. So this is a common thing that people commonly do that causes problems. So we'll just have a quick look at that. The right way, of course, to do it is to use this onComplete listener, right? So what that means is that this process of getting the last location, it's not a synchronous process anymore. It's asynchronous. So it's only going to give you the location when it's ready. It's not going to give you the location immediately. So if you ask for the location immediately, like with this line of code, you're going to get a big error. So let's have a look at what happens there. So I just made that little change, and we'll just have a look what happens. Okay, and I think maybe I just closed it then. I'll just try running it again. Or maybe it opened and closed really fast. Okay, so you can see that it did try and open, but we didn't even get an exception. I was hoping it would say that the application crashed, but it didn't even do that. So what I imagine's happened is it's crashed, and it's crashed straight away. Okay. So this is, I suppose, a problem that people have, is that you think that it's entirely, I guess, consistent with how our idea of how method calls work. But in this particular situation, because it's asynchronous, we have to wait for the method call to return using that callback. And if we try and call it directly, then we get this illegal state exception. So you might start to feel that you're, I don't know, an Android or a Java criminal or something because you've done something illegal. Sorry, that's probably a pretty bad, lame joke. Maps activity. So, and it tells us where the problem was as well, line 121. So don't do this type of stuff. Otherwise, you might find yourself to be in trouble with illegal state exception. Okay. So just put that bit of code back in, and then our application will be working again. So really, I guess it's just 3 lines. Well, it's a bit more than 3 lines of code, but it's really just the main thing is setting up this event handler here. So you actually just use your client object's last location, get the task, and then add an onComplete listener to that. Use that method's use that complete listeners onComplete method to get the location of the user, and then you can use that to create a little lat long object, and then use that to add that little marker to your emulator. So we can get that over here. Just zooming in a little bit. And we can see that we're still on the little pointer for Mount Roskill. One thing that I'm doing here that I forgot to mention is that I'm actually clearing the markers before I run this. And the reason for that is I clear the markers so that as I go, I don't end up with a lot of leftover markers from where the user was before. So this little bit of code here, that gives us our location just, I suppose, on demand. Well, not on demand, but for like a one-off execution. So we ask for our location, and then the onComplete listener, it'll give us the location, and then we plug those values into Google Map. So that's one mode of operation. When you use the fuse location service provider, and we're using that client. The second mode of operation is where you set up a repeated request that's going to run programmatically for a specific range of intervals. So you get given two intervals. You get given a normal interval. So here I've set up a little request. And normally, if the system's busy, or if we're in power saving mode or something like that, then the interval is going to be 2 seconds, 2000 milliseconds, right? I guess that's the worst case scenario for this, for updating our location. Or in the very best case, if our application has foreground, I guess, priority, then it's going to be every half a second or 500 milliseconds. So what the polling, I suppose, you get is somewhere between those two values, depending on how busy your phone is and how much battery life it has. And so what you can do is, again, the requests that you still use these asynchronous requests. You just set it up in a slightly different way. So use Eurofuse location service provider client again, and you just request these location updates. And what happens is, instead of just requesting the user's location one time and one time only, you get to actually request updates for a user's location. So you can ask for the user's updates, every 2 seconds, and then you can. Then what will happen is, when that actually executes, you can execute this little bit of code to clear your map or remove your markers, as we did for the other example. Get the user's location and then plug that into your map. Okay, so we're just clearing our map here. That's all the existing markers, and then we're digging out the location, the latitude and the longitude, and then bundling that up into a little longitude object, and then adding a little marker for that, and then moving our Google Maps camera to that. And from that, as the user moves, say for example, if you're driving in a car or something, you can move your user's marker around the map. So you could develop quite complex behaviors with that. So that is a very quick rundown on using both Google Maps, and then how you can combine that with the location services, so that you can do useful things like plot a user's location on the map. And I think that's pretty much it. Are there any questions about that? So trying kind of combine this week's presentation with next week's as well, and that'll just give us more time to go over some harder stuff later in the semester.
Yep, that's a good idea.
I'll just have a quick look at the lecture notes for location services. We'll just see if there's anything that we've missed. Okay, here we go. So I think we've just about covered everything. Yeah, so yeah, this is just all very just your usual stuff, knowing what GPS is. This is some code for interacting with the GPS and network provider sensors directly. If you ever wanted to do that, I would highly recommend that you don't do that. Using those sensors directly it looks easy, but it's very error prone. So I wouldn't do that. So there's with election notes, there's a little bit of extra information on how to do things like that, and a little bit of extra information as well. Oh, and here's something that I forgot to mention, the Gradle setting. So it's good that I looked at this. So just go back to the Google Maps example. Right, so the key thing with this is if you want to use this, if you want to use the Fuse location provider client, right, you have to add an extra library. And to do that, you need to go into your build.gradle file over here. And what you do is you just add in this extra little library here. It's something that is layered on top of the Google Play Services APIs. And so I'm using version 17, which is just the version that I got when I created a new Google Maps application through the wizard. So I also wanted to add to that the location, the Fuse location provider client stuff. And so that's all in this little library. So what this does is it just adds those extra libraries to our application. Some other little things that are also important. When you come to run this, you have to run it with an emulator that has Google Play enabled. So this is also something that's not always clear. So the emulator that I'm using just so happens, because I give these types of examples, it just so happens to have Google Play enabled. Let's see if I can get into I might just close my emulator. And I want to get into the manager. Why is that not working? I'll just bring this window over and see if I can get the window. So normally if you click on here, the AVD manager, you should get a window telling you what's going on. Oh, okay. It's my fault. I've got a couple of different monitors here. It's coming up on my primary monitor, which is all the way over the other side of the room. Okay, here we go. That's better. So if you click this button here, it takes you to into the AVD manager, right? It's now popping up on this window. So the key thing with this is that you want to have an emulator that has all of the supported platforms. So let's go into that again. Okay, that's better. So you need to make sure that your target includes the Google APIs. And sometimes it's also useful to make sure that the emulators that I'm using right now, they don't have the Play Store, but sometimes that helps to have the Play Store enabled as well. But basically, you need to have an emulator that supports the Google APIs, which is in addition to the normal Android open source APIs. So the Google APIs includes other things like Google Maps. So you need to use those, otherwise Otherwise, it won't work basically, and you'll get some weird errors. So that's another little trap that can happen when people come to do this. So I think I've tried to make it look easy, but it is so you have a go, but there's lots of little things that can go wrong. So don't get discouraged. Often it's things like missing Play Store, or the target that you're using. You're not targeting the Google APIs, things like that. Normally, like just one or two little problems causes a bit of a headache. Okay. So I think we've covered just about everything else. We've got the manifest permissions, which I've already talked about. This permissions stuff is quite complex, so we'll talk about that again next week. Here's another little example. And there's also some examples there on creating periodic updates. But that should, I think I've just about covered everything today. But as always, if you've got questions, let me know in an email. And so I thought the next thing that would be good to go through would be the second assignment. Which you should already have a copy of, hopefully. If not, go have a look on Moodle. So we've got the second assignment. I think the due date, it's probably a little bit aggressive, but we'll target for that. It's designed to not be a very difficult assignment. But it does cover some interesting things. So what this is going to cover is the stuff that we learned about a few weeks ago, web services, right? And what it's going to be is a combination of web services, sensors, the network provider sensors, the GPS sensors, and also Google Maps. So how can you fuse all of that information into a useful application? Okay. Right. So the first exercise is to develop an Android application using a Volley request queue. So that's something that we looked at the other week. That was probably the first week of the shutdown, lockdown level 4. We had to look at a few things like the API for different dog breeds and things like that. So you have to be able to replicate that type of application inside of your own project. So it's really up to you guys how you do these questions. They are exercise questions. You could have one project that allows you to go, that has some kind of navigation system to go through all of the different areas. Or you could have separate projects for each question. It's entirely up to you. I really don't mind. So, the simplest way of doing this is to just have a separate project, I suppose. So, separate project, and you develop a little application that allows a user to create one of these so-called REST API requests. You make a request, and you display the result in a user interface of your design. So it's really just, how do you create a user interface that can interact with a JSON REST API? And that's something that has been covered in in the examples for that particular presentation as well. So that should be reasonably easy.
Did we create our own JSON API, like which provides the JSON data, or we can use other
just
services?
so for this particular assignment, just use a publicly available JSON API.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you really want to create your own JSON API, and you can put together a hosting service, and it's going to be long-lived and available on the internet for the rest of the semester, then you're also, if you want to do that, please by all means go ahead. But this is really, it's a lot easier to just find a publicly available one and use that.
Okay.
So the second half of that is to develop a little user interface to allow a user to interact with that. That should be fairly easy. You don't have to how you develop your user interface, entirely up to you. If you want to use fragments, if you want to use a navigation drawer, any of those advanced things, please go ahead. You can go crazy. But on the other hand, you could just create something very simply with a text editor view and a button and a table, something very simple. So the third question, develop an Android application using the Fuse Location Service package. That's what I've just covered today. So you've just had a look at that. It's really about creating it's really about setting up the API, creating your client, and then creating your location callback, and then putting that into a user interface. And I think the second part of that question is to display, so the second half of that question 4 is to, you have a button, and then you can display that information in a very simple user interface. So, as you've seen today, it's probably like 10, 15 lines of code. So it shouldn't be very difficult. So these are all, I guess what we're doing here is we're just incrementally building up on our capabilities.
I have a question about number 1. Have we covered Volley? I don't remember Volley requests. Is it something? What is it? How is it?
So what Volley is, that's just, maybe I didn't mention it at the time, but Volley is the library that we're using. It's like the HTTP client library that we use for interacting with these JSON APIs.
Okay.
And that's all there in the presentation that I did for that, and also in the lecture notes.
Cool. Okay.
Okay, number 5. Number 5, develop a Google Maps application, which is, you've seen today, it's not that tricky. And we've kind of covered that assignment question just now in class as well. So again, it shouldn't be that tricky, but what we're doing is just incrementally building up our capabilities. So, we can do the JSON API requests. We can we can use Google Maps. We can use the location services. We can do all of these things individually. And that's some percentage of the assignment, just being able to replicate that. And then the other part of the assignment is to put everything together. So you get some extra marks for being able to do that. And I think this is the harder part of the assignment, actually. And probably the hard part is finding an API that allows you to, finding a JSON API that includes location information. So probably the obvious one is the Earthquakes API, which we had a look at the other week. Other obvious APIs are things like the Yahoo Weather API, or any other. I think there's an Open Weather API as well that's also publicly available. So whenever you get the weather, you also get the location information. So you could go away and create a little weather application that's driven by a JSON API behind the scenes, so you can get the weather, and then that JSON API, it has some location information embedded into it as well. You can, if we go again with the weather example, you can look at it. You can look for a specific location as well when you query that API. So when you get the weather on your Android phone, you don't get the weather for cities halfway around the world. You get the weather for Auckland. So it's about how you do that location and context sensitive search using your location services, to get the user's current location, and then plugging that latitude and longitude into another API, perhaps to get the address. And then using that to query your location aware REST API. You could query the earthquakes API and then get some information about earthquakes that have occurred around a user. All sorts of things. There are other location aware REST APIs as well. And then, you have to embed a Google Map fragment so you can actually display all of this information as well. So this is the part, building an actual useful application, that will be the hard part. That's question 6. Right, and then there's some other parts. Source control. Does everybody, I don't know if everybody knows about source control or source control systems, but again, I think that can be something that we look at next week. So I can just run through how you can use things like Git and Bitbucket or GitHub.
We covered this in another course, which is, I'm not sure if everybody's taking that one, but we covered that in the first few classes of web apps development.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe if you haven't covered it, I can cover it. Okay, most of our courses go over using GitHub. I mean, it's really easy, and it won't take long to cover, honestly. It'll probably take about 5 minutes to cover. But with that question, really, I just want to see evidence that you've started your project in the next week or two, and that, I can see that you've progressively and incrementally added to your project. It hasn't all just arrived the night before. So it's, again, just another type of quality assurance, really, for your work, just to validate it's something that you've done and that it hasn't just arrived for you at some point a couple of hours before the due date.
It's really good that it's 20 marks, because like it's not much we have to do, but it's really a lot of marks for that.
Well, yeah, so that's what you call a give me, I guess, a gimme mark. The other, this might be a little bit harder for people. Okay, and someone's saying, yeah, 2 or 3 hours. Okay, we'll try and start your assignments a little bit earlier, guys. Number 8 is just to create a signed APK for your project, so that we can take your APK file and upload it to our device, our phone, and have it run outside of the development environment. So again, that's 20 marks. There's 100 marks in total if you hadn't realized. So this one can be tricky because you have to test that your APK works on other people's phones, and often it doesn't work, or it doesn't work if it doesn't work if you haven't set up the permissions, or it doesn't work if you haven't set up your API key properly. So there's actually quite a bit to this this question, but it's one of the harder questions, I suppose, for this assignment. The last part is to just be able to demonstrate your project over Zoom. And I think the main thing I want people to be able to do is just a little bit of live coding. I'll ask you some tricky questions about your program. And for the most part, I'll probably get you to change parts of your program. Or if there's a part of your program that looks suspicious, I'll zoom in on that and ask you to change it to do something else. Nothing very tricky, but just to, again, validate that all of your project, all of your assignment is 100% of your own work.
So this is an individual assignment, right?
This is an individual assignment. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's actually, when you think, probably the 21st of May sounds like it's fairly soon, but when you think about what you have to do, it's probably not that bad. The hard part I think will be which API you use for question 6, the mini project. So it's all about fusing fusing information from a JSON API with information from your sensors, that type of stuff, and then putting it all into a user interface.
Could you give us an example of the JSON that we might use to compare with like a location-aware REST API that we choose, whether it is
it's totally open-ended, right? So what I mean by location aware is, so say for example, if you have a weather API, open weather, for example, there's definitely some way of plugging in an address to the weather API, right? So if you can get your address, or there's also some way of plugging or searching for weather based on your latitude and longitude.
Okay. So we should be able to send data to the API and receive JSON data from the API.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, if it was an XML API or a SOAP API, that would also be okay. But I think they're probably a little bit rarer anyway. So it's all about sending information from your sensors on your phone to an external endpoint, getting the external endpoint to do something useful with it, and then receiving the information and then displaying it inside of your application with Google Maps. You might need to overlay some other information on top of Google Maps. You might need to split the screen, so part of the screen is dedicated to Google Maps. The top half of the screen, that might be some other navigational controls or some other control panel for your application. So all of that'll be quite tricky in terms of layout and how you can design and develop your navigation.
Do you have like a demo from last few years that is a good student's demo, like we can see what an example maybe, if it's okay with you?
Yeah, that'd be fine. I don't have anything. It's a really good question, and I probably should have thought of that. But I don't have anything up and running from last year right now. But I can have a look and see what there is, and I'll dig something up, and we can have a look next week.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, so I think we've finished a little bit early, guys, but I think that's okay. All of their exercises for this week, they're really, you know, it's really just to get a start on that assignment. All of the information is available on Moodle, and I'll put up that little example that I've got set up in a couple of minutes. But are there any other questions? I've received everybody's first assignment with the extensions and things, so that's great. I'll be starting to mark those this weekend, and hopefully getting an assignment result back to you very soon. So hopefully everyone's happy with the course, and yeah, we're almost 2/3 of the way through the course. The only part that we still need to go over is the final project. So you might like to start thinking about a little project that you want to do either on your own as an individual or as part of a group, to make a little application that you can use to demonstrate your capabilities as a programmer. So you want to make it pretty special, and something that you can show off and show to people, say for example during a job interview or something, so that people can see that you don't just talk the talk when it comes to programming, but you've got these little portfolio pieces that that actually show that you can actually program as well. But that little project is still being moderated, so I'll reveal that in the next couple of weeks, and that would be due in at the end of the semester anyway, which is getting towards far end of June. So the only thing with that is it might coincide a little bit with the exam period, but hopefully you guys don't have too many exams. So I think that's pretty much it from me. I'll put that information up on Moodle. I'm going to mute myself and stop the recorder, and I'll hang around a little bit and see if anyone has any questions.